Welcome back, dear viewer, to Part 3 of the Hatharac Islands campaign. This episode will cover about 3 to 4 sessions of gameplay. However, we will be able to speed through most of the first session. It pretty much only consisted of getting ready, loading up on necessary gear from nearby towns, and just general prep for the journey ahead. See, as players, we had some metagaming knowledge on our side. Our previous party of adventurers had been killed in the dungeon that we were now going to, and so we, as players, understood the types of things we were going to go and deal with. And I'd actually like to take this moment to really shine a light on something the DM of this campaign did really well. Across the many years of playing D&D, I've had many different DMs and experienced many different DMing styles. I myself have DM'd for several years and have noticed how my style has changed over my many games. If you play long enough and with enough different DMs, you tend to notice that different dungeon masters have various strengths and weaknesses. Some may be really good at political drama, but might not be particularly good at designing engaging fights. Another DM might be really good at set-piece scenes, making you feel like you're really in the moment, describing everything brilliantly. But that same DM might struggle connecting those separate, beautifully described scenes into a cohesive narrative. The DM of this campaign had a real strength for thematic dungeons. Due to the fact that this campaign was so long ago, I'm undoubtedly going to forget a lot of the specifics as we go forward. But I do want to try to impress upon you, dear audience, how fun this DM's dungeons really were. See, the way he would design a dungeon is less with a variety of monsters or various bosses. It was more developed along the line of a type of encounter or a type of creature out of the monster manual that was more specific. Then he would find a multitude of different ways to present either the exact same monster or the exact same fight, but always in an increasingly creative way. A quick example from the adventuring party that died before the party we're following in this story was one of the earliest dungeons we went into was a plant-based dungeon. Now, in the monster manual, there aren't a ton of unique or interesting plant-based enemies, so he had to make some of his own, and his dungeon unfolded, and as it did, we experienced this ever-growing menagerie of biological opponents, which made the whole dungeon feel like we were walking into the heart of a sort of corrupted jungle. And the more we got into it, the more bizarre and fantastical and deadly the creatures became. Maybe it's just too hard to explain in a medium like this. Anyway, in the case of the dungeon we were now going to, this was his elemental dungeon. When our party last found it, it had been described as nothing more than a tall cylindrical tower, basically one room on each floor, 3 stories tall, a basic stone fortress. Gaining access through the front door through a sort of MacGuffin key we had found let us see that the center room was full of levers and buttons and gemstones. We eventually discovered, basically just through random chance, that if we directed a arrow device in the center towards a different gemstone, it would open up a portal in reality that would let us access different rooms of the dungeon. Each room of the dungeon was in a separate pocket dimension, and this was merely the entry hall. The dungeon itself was powered by elemental spirits, though we only learned this a little later, and they had begun to run amok in every room of the dungeon. And therefore, each room would have a different type of elemental enemy. We, in the last party, had only entered one and fought a large fire elemental before we all died, but we knew the DM's tendency to build thematic dungeons, and so we were all kind of expecting that there were going to be more elemental battles, even though the elemental spirit leak idea was only revealed to us later. And so, We go back to us prepping for this elemental idea. We were getting tons of things for fire resistance, weapons with reach to help us hit air elementals if they were doing flyby attacks, all sorts of things. Ways to damage augment our weapons with lower or lesser grade weapon crystals. Anything we could get our hands on, we went for. And we really needed to do this because in 3.5, actually in most editions of D&D, elementals can be bizarrely tough. Not just for them themselves just being massive sacks of hit points, but usually they have unique abilities or resistances that can make them hard to handle. But eventually we all got packed up and got armed to the teeth, and we set out for our several-day journey across the island to reach this fortress tower. Now, there were some random encounters along the way, nothing of spectacular note, maybe the odd roadside bandit, but it did give us plenty of time for us as players to do some fun, light role-playing. And this is one of the things that caused this campaign to really stand out in my mind. See, back in middle school to high school, while we all enjoyed playing D&D, we all tended to enjoy it more for the rolling lots of dice, high amounts of damage, and the laughter along the way if somebody rolled a 1. We didn't tend to do nearly as much of the role-playing aspect. We never really took the time to try to feel a part of the world. This was the first campaign I can remember in this group where it was kind of different. Rather than just hop, skip, and run to the next dungeon, we would take time to talk in character to each other. It was very basic at first, as all people new to role-playing games tend to be, but it was still a great deal of fun. We teased the Soul Knife character about his alcoholism, and he shot back at the Artificer for just being weird. The Artificer regaled us with stories of his really increasingly bizarre backstory about being born in a dream realm or something, to which all the rest of us just laughed and said it sounded more like a fairy tale. We all just kind of messed with each other, but did so in-game instead of out-of-game. It was a really good introduction to actually role-playing in D&D. But eventually, all the laughter had to come to an end, because we arrived at the Elemental Tower. The front door was still open from when the last party of adventurers had found it, and the devices in the center were still pointing at the red ruby, which had opened the portal to the Fire Elemental's room. However, rather than heading back into that room immediately, we tried to experiment more with the devices and levers in this central area. Now that we had an Artificer on our team who had a really good use magic device skill, which none of our characters in the last party had, he was able to gain a lot more understanding of the instrument and learn what we previously hadn't. It was in this moment that we actually learned about the elemental power source that was the fuel for the tower and its multiple portals, and that the elementals were slowly escaping and that the power was starting to become imbalanced in the tower. But we also discovered something else. One of the gems was purple, and even if we directed the arrow towards it, no portal would open. It was determined by the Artificer that there was a failsafe built into the system, that during times of elemental power failure, while the elementals were escaped and running crazy, this special room couldn't be opened, so that no elementals could gain access to it. However, if we could destroy any elementals that had currently escaped, the failsafe would be removed. And it also seemed like the leak was slow enough that even though we had left the fire elemental portal open, none of them had come through. So we needed to see how slow the leak was and whether or not this hypothesis could be acted out. So first, we turned the portal key back to the ruby and headed into the fire elemental room. We weren't sure what to expect. We had killed the last elemental, so either this room was going to be full of elementals, or maybe there was going to be none if the leak was really slow. Turned out, there were some elementals. 2, in fact. Both fire elementals, but this time, thankfully, only medium-sized. And all of our old corpses that we had kind of been hoping to strip of any useful gear had been already completely picked clean. They had been picked clean, as the DM informed us, by the party member who had betrayed us. This increased our desire to find his character in this world and kill it brutally. Fortunately for us, the difference in strength between a medium fire elemental and a large fire elemental is kind of dramatic, and so we won the fight laughably easy. With that room now taken care of, we backed out into the central tower and closed the fire elemental portal. We talked it over and decided that since the DM had told us 6 months had passed before this new campaign of adventurers had started, it was likely that the leak was slow enough that as long as we went through and killed all of the elementals within maybe a week's time or so, we could probably expect no other elementals to have leaked through, and that we could gain access to the purple gem room. Suddenly, though I don't remember confidently who it was, I believe it was the Soul Knife player who suddenly said, "Wait a second, guys, so these portals only open if we point the arrow at the gemstone." And the DM confirmed, yes, that's the case. And then, in reference to the 6-month break, he then confirmed with the DM that the leak of the elementals seems to be slow. The DM agreed that that timeline and the fact that there were only 2 elementals makes a great deal of sense. So then, he looked around at all of us and simply said, "Then we're not in a rush, and we're in a fairly defendable fortress if we close the door. Why don't we just sleep here in the center room with no enemies around, get a full night's rest, get all our supplies back, and then just handle the next room, and just handle each elemental room at full strength every time?" This all seemed pretty fair to us, and then we looked at the DM's face and saw that he had suddenly realized the flaw in his dungeon design. So, we all took a long rest, woke up, applied all the buffing spells we could, and turned to the Sapphire, and went on our way to battle the next elementals in the next several rooms. I believe the next ones were a large water elemental and then 2 earth elementals, but in between these, we would go back into the center room, go to sleep, resupply, rebuff, and then go back into the next one. And to go back for a second about what I was saying in regards to thematic dungeons, these weren't just isolated stone, blank-walled rooms that happened to have a water elemental in them. Each one was designed to become a interesting thematic combat with the elemental. The water elemental, for example, had been hiding in a hydrochemical area, and there were pools of poisonous water that we couldn't dare enter, but the water elemental could enter into and could maybe even mix with the solutions in them before it came back out again. I don't really remember what the earth elemental room looked like, but I'm sure it was cool, and I'm willing to give the DM full marks to the room anyway. We also discovered that some of the gems didn't actually lead to fights. Certain rooms were either just storerooms or laboratories that didn't have elementals in them, but did have some odd magic items. It was at this point that the DM was getting admittedly a little frustrated that we had circumvented this whole dungeon by simply exiting it, taking a long rest, and then going back in room by room. So he decided to punish us a little bit. One time, as we were all taking a long rest, he said that the one of us that was on watch heard something in the brush outside the door. We were all roused, and we got into our fighting stances and waited. The sorcerer, who was never one for patience, suddenly declared that he throws a fireball into the brush. The DM then asked for him to roll to see how close he could actually get to the target, since not only was he not the one who first heard it, he's not even sure where the sound was in fact coming from. He rolled poorly, and the DM informed us that that was the only reason that we didn't murder a child. Yeah, the DM's little nasty trick was to say that a little girl who had gotten lost in the woods happened to walk up near our tower and nearly got fireballed into smithereens. We heard her scream, we ran out and found her, and we all felt terrible. But thankfully, the sorcerer had missed, and therefore I didn't have to figure out how to roleplay a paladin freaking out over a murdered kid. The little girl asked us if we knew where the scary explosion had come from, and as we comforted her, we all looked at each other and said, No idea. Must be a monster around here." We decided that we would look after the little girl until such time as we could return her to civilization. And then, finally, we had only 2 gems left, a white gem and a purple gem. We went into the white gem portal and found bridges over an empty, instant death chasm, and 2 air elementals. This fight, while not difficult, was kinda deadly. The air elementals had a constant flyby attack and dedicated their attacks to trying to shove us off the bridges into empty space. And while this was terrifying, none of us thankfully died in this room. Sort of a testament to how poorly the DM rolled, but also we made sure to partner up so that if one of us started to get shoved, the other one could make a saving throw to try to grab them. This room, while the air elementals didn't end up doing a lot of damage to us, did leave us a little shaken because of the fact that we realized our DM was willing to use instant death pits. But with no other gems to go, after one last long rest, we opened the purple gem and went inside. We found a long marble staircase leading up to a massive hall. There weren't any walls or ceiling to the staircase. On the sides and above us, we saw a pocket dimension spreading out, filled with wild, shifting, arcane, and psionic powers. We stepped up to the top of the marble stairs and found that this pocket dimension was formed and held together by a network of force and magic that was beyond our understanding. In addition, at the top of the staircase, we discovered 2 figures and a whole lot of treasure. The first figure was massive, an iron golem, standing forward as the bodyguard to the second figure, who was a decrepit old figure. He was described as being humanoid, but of a race none of us had ever seen before. The old figure was staring at a psionically conjured image of the fortress that we had been invading, and not just the single tower on the outside, but psionically, it had depicted the entire fortress, these various tendrils connecting the different rooms in their own pocket dimensions. And this image was moving, showing that the fortress was gradually decaying. Over the many, many years of its existence, the elemental power source was bleeding out, and the psionic power that was keeping this tower together across the planes was beginning to give out. In fact, the only reason the entire structure hadn't given out was because the old figure sitting on the chair, as he declared, said he was holding it together. He, giving us a little bit of a monologue, had told us that he was the overseer of this fortress, this elemental power laboratory. He had controlled the tower, and his influence over the tower was barely keeping it together. We tried to talk to him more, to get more information out of him, about who he was, why he was here, and why did it seem so important to him to keep the tower around. The most we got out of him was his fiery declaration that it was the Emperor who gave him authority and responsibility over this tower, and he was to guard it and its contents until such time as the Emperor deemed it fit to call him. And with that, battle was joined. What followed was a tale of 2 combats. One, an engaging, interesting, complex combat with unique mechanics and engaging moments, and the other, an endless string of frustrating rolls and annoying mechanics. Here's how it went down. The Iron Golem and I immediately squared off with each other. The Iron Golem was the tank for the old dude, and I was the tank for the party, so we just immediately crashed into each other, while the rest of the party moved around to try to engage the old man, who apparently was not an old man at all, but a hybrid creation of the DM, taking the blueprints of a chain devil and adding some other interesting abilities along with it. Immediately, out of the treasure pile that was all around the old man, suddenly flung out as extra enemies and appendages that the old man could control by thought. They would grapple, throw, push, and move us players around with ease. All the while, he himself had a set of similar tendrils that were much smaller and only went about 10 feet off him, but he had much more control over these and could make multiple attacks per round. The ranger, usually able to just sit back and fire arrows, began to struggle because of the sheer length of the mechanical tendrils. And because the old man had some crazy deflection bonus against range attacks, including magical ones, even the sorcerer was having a hard time pinning him down. The soul knife kept trying to get in close, but he wasn't super tanky, and so the multitudes of attacks that could be made against him posed a real threat. And so the rest of the party tried to come together and solve this engaging puzzle. And that is where we come back to the Iron Golem's initiative. The Iron Golem rolled to hit me and hit well. And it was at this point I discovered it had improved trip. My character was tripped onto his back and then repeatedly punched in the face. And here my combat began. On my turn, I tried to stand up, which due to a special property of the Iron Golem, enabled an attack of opportunity, which hit me in the face, and activated improved trip, which brought my character flat on his back, where he remained until the Iron Golem's next turn, where he would repeatedly punch me in the face. This is where both I and the DM reached a kind of frustrating stalemate. See, my weapons weren't good enough to overcome the damage reduction of the Iron Golem, and the Iron Golem's AC was so high that attacking from prone was basically worthless. So I had to get up, but my stats weren't great enough to pass the tumbling check to get away without triggering an attack of opportunity, and a 5-foot step away wouldn't give me enough movement to stand up. The Iron Golem's attacks were good, but not actually good enough to finish me quickly, but with improved trip, it basically kept me out of the fight anyway. Basically, every turn, the Iron Golem would trip me, punch me in the face, I'd try to stand up, he'd trip me again, and punch me in the face. And even after I did eventually fall unconscious, that didn't actually free up the Iron Golem, because I had picked the Die Hard feat, which meant even after I hit 0, I stay conscious until I'm fully dead. I had some healing potions, some little healing abilities, and I used all of them to keep myself going, and as a result, the Iron Golem was kind of just stuck on this single target mode. So, I guess in my way, I did fulfill the role as tank, but I don't think in the rest of my time as a D&D player, I've ever had quite the level of utter frustration and disappointment in my character or in a single combat. I mean, just every turn, stand up, trip, punch in face, stand up, trip, punch in face. Eventually, the party did defeat the old man, and then turned their attention to the Iron Golem, which they promptly destroyed. Which was good, because I was at that point only one hit away from being permanently dead. As soon as the fight ended, the DM described that the whole pocket dimension began to crack around us, and if we didn't leave quickly, we were going to be stuck in this dying realm. We grabbed what treasure we could, especially one piece of treasure that had been in high prominence, a jar filled with a white silvery liquid masking a strange device inside. So our new party of adventurers had finally grabbed one of the MacGuffin pieces of our campaign. And with that, as well as a bunch of other loot, we ran out of the door. There was a loud cracking sound, several flashes of arcane and psionic power, and the tower went inert. All the mechanisms inside either burning out or just completely destroying themselves. We breathed heavily, got the little girl back to her parents, and went to our canyon base and promptly fell asleep.